Okay, excellent. So thanks, of course, for doing this. We're doing Virgil as our book of the month this month in March. So yeah, we thought Mitch from All Stars suggested getting in contact with you and that you'd be interested in doing a, connecting up and helping us out. So yeah, thanks a lot for that.
I'm happy to. Just for my information, how early is it in Australia?
So it's currently 7:13 a.m. It's not too bad.
Right, that's not
coming up again.
It's not super early. Okay. When I was in Scotland, I was staying up until 5 in the morning every day, so I'm totally out of whack. But okay, so it's already Thursday for you. All right, I understand.
Yeah. And it's Wednesday afternoon for you.
Yeah, you can see it's very shitty out. I guess not. But it's New York. It's not that exciting, trust me.
Sure. Not exciting at all. Okay. So I guess I want to start.
So I lost some of your audio, my friend, for a moment there.
Okay. How about now?
Yeah, you're back.
Yeah, cool. So I want to ask, how did you first get into comics? What books did you start reading, and where did you go from there?
Well, so there weren't a lot of good comic stores where I grew up in upstate New York, so I started going to like flea markets and garage sales and buying a lot of things that came out in like 1987, 1986, which means like some of my first comics were the West Coast Avengers and other really like traditionally maligned books these days, so I have really weird taste. But so then finally I got into some, I started like bookstores started carrying current comics so I could buy things that were actually out in the present day. And I was, a very traditional like superhero type reader when I was a kid, but I started going to Comic-Cons trying to get into comics when I was like 13 or 14. And that's when I started meeting a lot of other indie creators and getting into more like Vertigo and even beyond that sort of smaller publishing books, So because you go for Electric Blue Superman, but then you see all these people doing these cool comics and you sort of like see that there's life outside of DC and Marvel. So, for me, like when I was younger, the book I'm doing at DC, Midnighter, was a huge influence on me when he was in The Authority, starting in 1998. That was when I was 13. But also books like Enigma at Vertigo, a huge influence on me. Like they were doing queer representation, before people even knew that it could be possible. And like, it's not even before it was cool. It was like before people even realized what was happening. And it was just there with like a big splash drawn by Duncan Fegredo of a guy sleeping with a guy post-coital. So, ruined me from the start, but that's what comics are here for. So I read a lot of that, and like in the early 2000s, I still read, I like the sort of iconography of genre, and that includes like DC and Marvel stuff, but it also includes like high crime books, the type of stuff we do in Virgil. And also just, I met a lot of creators who were doing books that were totally left of center when it comes to subject matter. Like one of the books, for whatever reason, that always influenced me that a lot of people have never heard of is called The Homeless Channel, which is by Matt Salady. And mad props to him, because much like me, he is a writer and was trying to get his book off the ground and found that he couldn't find the right artist. So he found a way to make art for the Homeless Channel, and he actually ended up drawing it and lettering it himself. It came out through AIT Planet Lair back when they were publishing a lot of stuff. And it was just sort of about homeless people and this sort of like struggle that people don't usually tackle in comics, and gave him this really cool representation. And I also respected that it was a book that he made, he just had to make happen, even outside of his own, some people stop when it doesn't work a couple times, but he really pushed through and made it real. So is sort of always been an influence on my career, even though it's like this nothing book when it comes to awareness, but it's an incredibly important book, I think, when it comes to the subject matter. And it's sort of what I try to do with, something like Midnighter, something like Virgil. The idea is just getting these eyes on communities and things that people haven't really seen before, and doing it in an exciting, interesting way. So it's been a strange sort of path from, you know, red onesie jumper Hank Pym in 1988 to where we are now. But that's how I got here, from 25-cent comics to, you know, man-on-man action to superheroes to now we're doing gay crime stuff in Jamaica.
Cool. Excellent. So I guess keeping on the Virgil topic, can you tell me where you got your inspiration from, particularly in creating Virgil, the character? One of our members, Michael, thought that you might have seen a documentary by the BBC that was about queer people living in Jamaica, but that was just his idea. So, where did the thought? Yeah.
So the inspiration originally did not have to do with Jamaica. It had to do with doing a queer crime noir and doing sort of this like exploitation style queer revenge story. So the real inspiration was me seeing Django Unchained and thinking that it was kind of weak. You know, I mean, who am I to throw shade at Quentin Tarantino? But it's not like he's going to this book club or cares what I think. So, and even if he did, it would just help me. So, you know, it struck me like when they came out, at least in America, the marketing was like, this movie is so edgy and oh, it's so risky. But like, it's 2013 or ever it came out. Like, what's fucking risky about saying racism is bad? Nothing, unless you're an asshole. So when I came out, I said, you know, if this movie had balls, it would have had Django being gay. And, you know, going back to what I mentioned with the homeless channel, I wasn't really going to wait for someone else to do that. I said, well, I'm just going to do that book. I'm going to do it myself. And it happened that I was talking to JD Faith, who I met through a previous anthology that we didn't work together on, but we were in the same book. And he had already told me he wanted to do noir because he had at that point a rampant obsession with Nicholas Winding Refn and doing this type of interesting color theory for a book. So this came together with us saying we're going to do queer crime noir. And that's when we got looking into where it could take place, you know, where could we push it further in terms of representation, and doing what I consider to be the work of comics, which is showing people something they've never seen before. So I looked at Sub-Saharan Africa, I looked at Russia, both of which have not amazing records. And if you're, you know, with the queer community, if you're going to do a revenge story, they were great places. But when I looked into what was happening in Jamaica, I found it even more sort of interesting due to the contrast. You know, no one looks at Russia or Sub-Saharan Africa as this vacation hotspot, but especially for a lot of American readers, and maybe even beyond that, like Jamaica is looked at as the sort of vacation paradise where you like smoke some weed and kick back. Well, that's fine, except, you know, for 80% of the gay male community that are living in a storm drain, it is not that at all. So that contrast between reality and sort of fantasy, I found very interesting about it. And that is when I got into doing a lot of research, both with people who live, you know, gay men who live there that I had personal contact with. Obviously, you know, you can read quotes, you can connect on social media, you can read interviews. In reference to the BBC thing, I think I might have seen that. Is it possible? It's possible it was released by Vice Media here, because I did watch a documentary called, I think it was called Young and Gay, Jamaica's Gully Queens. Yeah. And it sounds similar to that. It was about a half hour long, and it sort of digs into the people who are living in the gully, and that was a strong influence on me. It's also something I consider a great primer for anyone who just sort of wants to see what's going on there. Because it sort of sums it all up in, you know, in 20 to 30 minutes. Again, you know, it's not even for people who live in more privileged countries where the fight is for like marriage equality and being able to visit your partner at the hospital. These people are fighting for their life. And so that's something that with Virgil, we wanted to tap into and, you know, give a voice to the people living that. And nothing is more pleasing to me than when I sent the book to some of them before it was released to get their opinions. And they were just so happy that people could know about this now. And so why Jamaica? It's because, to me, like, that's what exploitation should do, you know, which is what we're modeling it off of. When things like Sweetback's Badass Song and like Shaft and Foxy Brown came out in the 1970s, it was, you know, it was raw. It was a reaction to the sort of subjugation of the African American community to from the mainstream. And it used these action sort of genres, and this is why I say genre material, as a vehicle to get these very real, this sort of hyper real genre as a vehicle to get this very legitimately real struggle and fight across to people who otherwise maybe would have known about it. You know, if you are going to the movies, you want to go see an action movie, you maybe don't know in 1973 like what the African American community is facing, but you find out through this character that you want to root for, you know, and you do that both in those movies and in Virgil by tapping into what genre does so well. And that's these universal drives where even though on the outside things may look different and they might divide the readership, the characters are all fighting for something that anyone can relate to, you know, protecting the ones we love, you know, in that heat of adrenaline, that fight or flight time. You know, maybe the ones we love are different. Maybe they look different than other people's loved ones, but that drive is something we can all relate to. So I think what the benefit of it is you whittle these super complex things down. You know, you can't leap a canyon with people, but when you get down to the bottom, obviously, the two sides are very close together. And that's what these things do. You whittle away all the things that don't connect people, and you get down to the strong emotional core that can show people how they can be brought together. Now with Virgil, we do that by punching a lot of people in the face and blowing a lot of things up, but I think you can still do it in that way.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, excellent. You brought up other locales that were possible, as like Russia and that such. If queer exploitation was to become like a genre like blaxploitation, do you think you or other creators could use those locales as you know, settings for their stories?
I mean, sure, the bad shit happens to gay people in plenty of places.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, if we did a sequel, I might want to set it in Russia. I lived in Russia for a little while, so I have a little more experience with it. You know, the answer is yes. I mean, you can set these type of stories anywhere. Honestly, you could set these type of stories in North Dakota, and like someone has been wronged somewhere. Maybe not in Canada, but like the but you know, the thing is, if I were to continue it, I would probably want to move to a different area. I probably would want to go to sub-Saharan Africa, because then again, you run the risk of saying like, oh, all of these nations of color just are so anti-gay, and you don't want to spread that message either. You know, part of me, you know, when you're doing this type of representation, especially when you're from outside the community, and that's why I took 2 years of research to put this together, is you want to make sure, you know, it was important to me. It's kind of like when you dial it back in representation in general, right? People from outside a community, they say, oh, well, there's a gay person in that movie. What are you complaining about? Okay, but the gay person was like this pederastic villain that was like murdering people. That's not actually helpful. So, you know, the worry I have doing more stories like Virgil, you have to move outside the African, or sort of communities of color, because we don't want to say that that's all they do. And even within Virgil, we wanted to show that there were plenty of allies too, you know, and not just everyone is against him. Sometimes he's against himself because he is much more human than a lot of other characters I write, and makes mistakes, and he's pessimistic. But I think the thing is like, you can do, Virgil is just sort of in a blueprint in the way of telling queer stories, where I think that my own work, and it's just my take because other people feel very strongly in the opposite, which is totally fine, is doing stories that feature queer characters, feature characters of color, feature characters of different creed, but they are not about those things. The stories themselves don't fetishize those religions, those sexualities, those genders, those races. And so Virgil is not a book. It's a book about a gay male, but it's not about gayness. And when I say that is because I think, at least in my opinion, that inadvertently, sometimes when you set out to tell a type of story, it does put an extra spotlight on it in a way that is not really normative. You know, we just want to be able, in my opinion at least, to walk to the store and get some groceries, and walk to the store and get some groceries. But what we don't want is to like walk to the store and get some groceries and have a bunch of straight people walking behind us being like, great fucking job, and I'm so okay with that. I'm not bothered by this at all. That's wonderful. And so I feel like that is sort of the unintended, you know, unintentional side of certain perspectives when you certain approaches. And so I think that helps. You know, we have a lot of crossover readership with things like Virgil and Midnighter because we don't make a big deal out of these things, and that doesn't mean they're not important and vital, but it's more just about how you present everything to a wide readership. Everything, the book itself doesn't think it's unusual that Virgil is gay, and hopefully then the readers don't as well.
Yep. Okay, cool. Now, you did mention if you were to set one in Russia that you had lived there and had a bit more experience sort of firsthand. Would you have liked to gone down to Jamaica and like spent a little time there at all, or was that not really, I guess it's not really feasible at all, or, you know, with when you're trying to create a comic and using Kickstarter, like sometimes that kind of thing isn't possible.
Well, that's the answer, right? Like, I was very happy to have direct contact with people on the ground there, but ideally, sure. But in reality, the life of a comic creator does not afford me to take expensive vacations, even if they're tax write-offs. You know, I think that there's never too much research, there's never too much experience that can go into a book. So yeah, if I had like a theta sign next to my wallet, or we had an amazing patron or something, I would love to do that. But I think the contact with people, whether you are geographically there or one-to-one on the internet, one-to-one with people who have escaped, that's what's important. You know, in the case of Jamaica, like I said, I had people who reviewed the book before it came out and gave notes that are living there. I also dealt with had a couple interesting experiences with sort of the type of toxic masculinity that is prevalent in Jamaica as well. I mean, I swam with some people from Jamaica in college, and their point of view was interesting. But at the same time, again, just to prove that point, two guys on my swim team from Jamaica, one extremely open-minded and level-headed, and the other one, you know, basically like a human thumb when it came to thought processes. So it's not to stereotype that area. There's plenty of amazing work. And again, important to me to show that in Virgil, you know, J-Flag, he goes to J-Flag. They do amazing work there. They're constantly fighting to get people to safety, to do as much as they can. So, you know, obviously is the fight where people would want it to be? No, but it's not hopeless, and it doesn't need outside. I always hesitate to, you know, oh, like everyone should go and help. Like, people are really trying within the community to make it better. So, I wanted to make sure everyone knew that when we sort of started out with the book, and that's why we end in J-Flag in the end of chapter 1.
Cool, excellent. Now, as the creator of Virgil, how do you view him? Do you view him as a hero, an anti-hero, or do you think it's somewhere more in between in the gray area?
I mean, this is, when I gave dual interviews on Midnighter and Virgil, this is what I get asked this a lot. I think Virgil's a hero, but he's not a superhero, you know, and like that, I think it's important, as I said, that he's human. He makes a ton of mistakes, and he's often the victim of his own pessimism. But is that not very human in of itself? You know, do we all? None of us are right all the time. You know, he has a big part of the story for me, and I don't know if that makes him an anti-hero, but he is sort of trapped by his own sort of pyramid, house of cards of lies that he's been holding up because of fear. The story's about power. You know, he hides behind, almost mistake one is that he hides behind these traditional symbols of power, a gun and a badge. But he doesn't achieve real power, as you see, until he owns, you know, until he sort of steps into his own agency and lives openly, you know, as this gay hero. And that's when he gets true power in the story. But, you know, the action of the story is only predicated on the lies that he himself told to his partner as part of his facade. And so it's all sort of cyclical. His move from fear to self-belief and power, you know, the story basically is maybe in some ways a tragedy, because in a perfect world, he never would have had to lie. He never would have had that fear of coming out of the closet, and none of these things would have happened. But again, I think that's very human. You know, we are, I mean, again, at least myself, we are oftentimes somewhat jaded. We are oftentimes pessimistic. Nothing sums it up to me more than when he visits his friend Natalie to me, which was like a very important scene to me. Because he goes and she says, you know, she doesn't have like like some sort of like magical angel reaction. She says, you know, like, it's pretty fucked up that you're gay, but also lying to me, you know, for 10 to 15 years is even more fucked up. And he assumes that she's going to turn on him and leaves, and you see that he's wrong about that. You know, he has been trained by society to expect the worst out of people. And so I think that Virgil is a hero because he is fighting for something we all want, and he's trying to do the right thing. And that doesn't mean he's aspirational. He's certainly the hero of the story, but I definitely don't think that everyone should just go out and like decapitate their enemies with machetes. That only works so many times. But at the same time, after doing the story about a gay superhero, I wanted to make it like this is just a person. He's not indestructible, and he makes mistakes, but that doesn't mean that he's not any less righteous, and that doesn't mean that he's not any less driven. And I think that's very important because none of us are perfect, and we want to be able to see ourselves in Virgil, regardless of if we actually look like him. We always want to be able to see ourselves in the hero.
Cool. So Virgil is obviously quite a masculine character. How do you think that his queerness and his obviously relationship with his partner, how does your portrayal of him disrupt or challenge ideas of masculinity and what it means to be masculine as opposed to, you know, being a gay man and what it means to be a masculine gay man?
Well, Virgil so his outward behavior, especially before the turn of the story, is very masculine. But you'll see in many ways, you know, when he's home, he is much more resigned. You know, he's much more neutral when it comes to those things. But the massive subversion to me is that, like, when you see Virgil and Irvine in bed, Virgil is the bottom. And, you know, it is somewhat stereotypical so on one hand, it's stereotypical to say, once you know about the gay community, that being a bottom is more feminine versus masculine. But without that, it is also which because those are obviously just, that's not necessarily the case. It doesn't have to be. But without those things, when you're looking at the greater community and how it's perceived, especially amongst the people in the story that are hyper-masculine, it's the biggest challenge to that sort of normative masculinity, which is a house of cards. You know, like traditional masculinity is so fragile. That's also why the pushback is so violent. Like, you know, when a tiger is wounded, when your armor is weak, you react the most violently, and that leads to a lot of the violence in the story. So Virgil, this character who is powerful, who is assertive, who is all these things that you traditionally associate with masculinity, and then we see him bottoming, it is the ultimate subversion of what those people think of as masculinity. He's receiving the very symbol of traditional masculinity. And I think that hopefully subverts that notion. So, I mean, he both performs sort of historically feminine acts, you know, societally feminine acts within the greater sort of strata of society, even though that is not the case within the known and educated queer society, while embodying many of the things that these, you know, traditionally straight, traditionally masculine people would look up to. Virgil is a badass. Virgil is super confident, but he's super confident and badass while talking about how much he loves sucking cocks. And that's not something that they allow. That's not diction that they allow. And so to me, like, it was important to me, not only that he is definitely not, you know, not only that he is willing to at least be verse or a bottom, but as well that he's willing to say these things. Again, once he becomes empowered, he almost understands masculinity as a tool. You know, you see, you know, fragile masculinity is what saves him from being killed by King Bandaloo. Because he knows that saying those things and then challenging Bandaloo's masculinity after it is an affront that he can't allow. So Virgil's agency and control of masculinity, I think, is ultimately what goes through the story. The contrast begins as you sort of see his private versus public life, but also it's what allows him to sort of make it to the end once he sees it for what it is, which is basically a weakness. You know, it's because it's self-doubt. Anyone that is that fragile, again, it really comes about not believing in yourself. And so I think his ascent to a person who truly believes in what he is and truly is unashamed of what he is really the antidote to the masculinity, again, which is connected to power that he thought was going to protect him before.
Cool. Now, was going into writing this book, was one of the key themes going to be, you know, discussing masculinity and what it means to be masculine in a gay context, or was that something that just organically grew out of the character?
I mean, I think well, the way I work, first of all, not to lessen people who think that I'm a mastermind, does not involve a lot of pre-planning.
Yeah.
It involves a lot of revision. But beyond that, I think that you have to know that you're going to dig into these things if this is the genre you're working in, you know? Like I've said it before, and I will inevitably say it again. Most of my books are just me rewriting Die Hard. And so, you know, if you're going to be living in the action movie genre, which is oftentimes the height of masculinity, you have to know you're going to have to make a statement on that. And just by saying that this gay man can occupy that space, you know, that John McClane can be saving his husband and not his wife, you're making a statement on masculinity. It's kind of like, even if you don't set out to do that, you're doing it anyway. So you might as well know that what you're getting into.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Awesome. So, as a queer creator in comics, it's a somewhat underrepresented voice. How do you feel it is important to write books from a queer perspective, or to include queer characters as main characters rather than just side characters in your book?
Well, I mean, I think I touched on that a little earlier, you know, like I think it's vitally important, and not just, you know. So first of all, the one thing is, I think that being queer and being in any minority is not a siloed experience. So if you feel the need for representation of your community, really, I feel like you have a responsibility to push representation forward for all communities. You know, we are not, it's not a fight that's being fought in tandem, in parallel to someone else. We're all sort of really in it together. Now, obviously, that doesn't always work out that way in the greater context. You know, plenty of communities don't like other minority communities, but that's not the way I like to be. So, you know, not that, I mean, comics are going to make that big of a change, but so from my perspective, although they can, who knows? But like, so from my perspective, I try to fit as much in as possible, but as I said before, I don't want the book to sort of be fucking pleased with itself for doing it. Like there's no other way to say that. Like every time I do a creator-owned book, and as often as I can in a work-for-hire book where I'm not, you know, mandated to do one thing or the other, I'm going to fit in as much representation for queer characters, for characters of color, for characters of other religions and what have you, as possible. And I'm gonna do it and give them the agency and the participation that they deserve. And I'm not gonna, you know, I almost want it to be, you know, the books are just going to be kick-ass books that feature these characters. And, you know, I guess it almost isn't my problem. Like on one hand, I shouldn't say that. It's not my problem where people then place it in a genre. You know, I don't set out to make gay action books. I don't set out to make, you know, gay romance novels or whatever. Not that I've done a romance novel. Gay thrillers. Gay thrillers, you know? Like, I set out to make kick-ass thrillers that star gay people, kick-ass action books that star gay people or queer people. And, you know, people can then place it in the context that they want. I know there are people that feel it's very important to say this is a gay action book. You know, and I'm not here to disagree with them. I can only say what I set out to do, and promote equality within the narrative. You know, people ask me, the best example is not about Virgil because it doesn't have a one-to-one example. The best example is when I do work for hire stuff. When Midnighter started, people said, oh, well, Steve, how are you going to deal with the gay sex? Because the gay sex, you know, and what are you going to do? And I said, well, you know, it's a T+ book, first of all. And we're going to treat it, you know, and in his relationships, the gay relationships, but what about them? And, you know, well, we're going to treat him, and we're going to treat his sex scenes and his relationship scenes, here's a shock, exactly the same way we would if it was Green Arrow or Nightwing, and it's going to get the same amount of time, and it's going to get the same amount of, you know, there's not going to be eyes darting around, and there's not going to be any second guessing, and that's what it's going to get because it's going to be treated equally to those characters. And that's how I sort of look at all of this content, at least from my point of view. I know other people have some different points of view, and I think that, that's totally fine too. But from where I'm coming from, I want the narrative itself to promote equality and promote not normativity, but normalization for other characters of seeing these things. You know, when I say normative, it's a loaded word, and I don't mean that everyone needs to be straight acting or everyone needs to be cisgender. I mean that I want the experience for those characters to be unspectacular in the way that in my books, you know, a differently abled trans queer person could still walk down the street and get a coffee, and there wouldn't be that scene that you feel like you would have 20 years ago where someone is snapping a fucking iPhone picture or, like, you know, asking, you know, if they're a boy or a girl. Those things, we've moved past those as society, and I feel like, you know, the books need to as well.
Yeah. I guess in the last 5 or so years, we've been, like, queer representation has definitely improved, especially in, you know, just the normalization of it. And where do you see it going in the future? Like, obviously the goal is for it to just be like, here's a queer character, we don't need to advertise it at all. Where do you see it going?
Exactly. But I think, the answer is more, you know, because you can't, so it's kind of like a misnomer that you can never have enough representation of anything. And I know that, like, conservatives get worked up about that, but the ratio is so small. You know, Virgil and Midnighter, it is actually impossible for them to sum up the experiences of every queer person. It's just impossible. And so what we need is more, and not just me writing them. We need more queer voices in comics. We need more stories, because in many ways, the more that there are, the more pressure it takes off creators to sort of be everything for everyone. And that's something I've never set out to do, you know, because if you try to create a book that somehow speaks to the life experience of every queer person a little bit, it's going to speak to the experience of a group of readers barely at all. It's going to be vanilla. It's going to be surface level. So I think what's important is not to stop doing these things, to do more and to do different, but to treat them all the same way, to make them actually fully realized, fully thought out explorations of these characters that treat them as people. You know, the stories have to treat any type of minority character as a person. So if you have, in the same way that having a villain be queer doesn't really count, if you have a queer character and all that the reader knows about them is they're gay, then they're not a real character. They're like a casting call sheet. And so what we need is a more in-depth and sort of layered representation, and then we need more books. And maybe they don't all come out at the same time, but we need it so when someone picks up Virgil, when someone picks up Midnighter, when someone picks up Fun Home or Kaptara or Angela, Queen of Hell or something, it can be these great, fully realized stories, and the onus isn't like, oh, like this is the only book I'll ever have. It has to be just like me. And I think that's what people feel. You know, right now the thirst for representation is so strong because they haven't had it. It's been a drought, and it's growing. But everybody wants to get in. Everybody wants their story to be told, and they deserve that. So the answer is, where's it going to go? We have to continue the style of work that we've been doing, which is this humanizing, respectful style, but we need to broaden laterally, and we need to do more of it and tell different stories so that people can feel that they've been represented in comics. And, like, the best example of what everybody needs, in my opinion, actually goes back to superhero comics, you know, and I say it in almost all of my sort of LGBTQ panels. You know, Superman was popular in the 1930s because, you know, he was basically like the Jewish golem. He was like the ultimate immigrant, and you came to America and you read that and you said, oh man, like, you know, life is terrible, you know, whatever. I work in a textile mill, but wait a minute, like, this guy is just like me. You know, Superman is just like me. He came here too, and maybe my life can be mythic too. And then in the 1960s, it was Peter Parker. You know, Peter Parker is Spider-Man. He's got a cool outfit and he's got cool powers, but oh man, he can't make rent and he can't get the girl, and his, like, you know, he's lost his uncle and his aunt has a weird haircut. And, but you know what? Like, that's just like me. And Peter Parker is just like me. And so that moment to me is something everyone deserves to know that maybe their life, you know, can be mythic too. And then you see it with, hopefully with Midnighter, you see it with Kamala Khan, Ms. Marvel, at Marvel. It's hard to say that, Ms. Marvel at Marvel. Anyway, and so that moment isn't unique to superhero comics. It's what fiction and it's what comics do. It's what, you know, fiction across the spectrum does. And everybody deserves that. So the answer where we're going, you know, the work isn't done until everybody gets that. And, you know, it's almost impossible for everybody to get that. So really the work will never be done. But I don't think that's a bad thing. That's creating fiction in general.
Cool. Excellent. So I guess there's probably just the one more question. That's, I think it's the question that most comic creators get quite a lot. A few of the members wanted to know, you know, they love your run on Midnighter, but they'd also love to know which other character, if you had any chance to write one across any of the publishers, who would you write? Where would you take them? What changes would you make? Yeah.
Well, what changes I would make, that's certainly a recipe to get me fired. But, I mean, so the cheat answer, which is not a lie, is that you know, Midnighter was a bucket list character, and I sort of like started in comics on a bucket list character. Like if you knew me, if you knew me like 5 to 7 years ago, I'd be sitting in upstate New York at like 4 in the morning at a coffee shop, you know, fetching with my friends about how I would fix this character and why isn't he in a book anymore, you know? So it is still kind of insane to me a year later that, you know, A, I got to do it, and B, like, you guys actually liked it, you know? So, but no, I mean, like, I actually really love Magnus Robot Fighter, so that's a pretty deep cut.
Yeah.
But he's this character created by Russ Manning in the 60s, and like absurd costume. He's a man who wears like a power skirt. And then he was raised by, he's kind of like a robot Tarzan. So he's a human that was raised by robots, but his fists are strong enough to punch through robots. So, you know, take whatever subtext you want from that, but I just think it'd be really fun to write. I also really love, like the gas mask Sandman. Stay tuned on that because it's one of my favorite characters. Same with Martian Manhunter, who's my favorite character ever.
Yeah.
Problem with that is that Rob Williams is doing a great job and he's a friend of mine, so I can't kick him off that book. But someday, man, me and Martian Manhunter, the problem is I would like have to burn an effigy with myself in it after I work on him, so it has to be the last thing I ever do. But I love him. I love the everyman aspect, like, of Captain Universe at Marvel. Talking about that sort of comic moment that we get as a reader, Captain Universe being this universal power that literally anyone can be chosen for, seems like the in-comics version of the comics moment. Like, in a world where Spider-Man exists, maybe I could have this insane godlike power, even if I'm like a Starbucks barista. So I do fucking love Captain Universe as well.
Yep. Excellent. Out of that, I guess I just had another question. You know, queer representation has gotten better, but we definitely used to be drawn to the outsider characters like Martian Manhunter. He's a favorite of mine from DC. But also, you know, the X-Men. They're born like special, but everyone hates them for it, I guess. So it's like minorities are drawn to those kind of characters. Mm-hmm. Why do you know, how do you think about that? Like, sorry, that wasn't quite eloquent. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
On minorities identifying with outsiders?
Yeah, like, well, you know, X-Men are a classic example, I guess.
Well, I think that well, okay, so the first answer about the X-Men is, again, like, it ultimately is a wish fulfillment, right? Like, what if instead of having a disability or, you know, sexual orientation that people in mainstream society may find unappealing, I had fucking lasers that shot out of my eyes, or could control the weather, or, you know, was a really hairy Canadian dude with claws. Like, so on one hand, like I think we're drawn to things like the X-Men because it takes problems and stressors in our life and makes them into this amazing story. And yes, you know, obviously X-Men are it's a world that hates and fears them, but it's a world that hates and fears them for having fucking awesome superpowers. So I do
When
think that
all the other
there's,
powers are fine. Yeah.
you know, and like, so there's that aspect of it. But I will say it didn't come up in the question, but I think there's a lot of the, so when I decided in Midnighter to not have him have a secret identity, because this is something I realized very quickly, like someone who's, I found it hard to believe that someone who was potentially in the closet, even though he would never be in the closet, like would then have a secret anything and like would then have a secret identity. Like, so from the beginning we were like, you know, Midnighter's out of the closet as gay, he's out of the closet as a superhero. And anyone that doesn't like that can fuck themselves. And like, so I think that we empathize in general sometimes with these characters because that double life experience that they have, like that Batman has, some of us have had to live that. When you're living in the closet, you're a different person outside in the mainstream world than you are at home. And so less and less now because we are reaching equality and it is less of a shock to come out. But that coming out experience, you know, should I tell Vicky Vale I'm Batman? I mean, come on, that's our experience, you know? But again, it's still a wish fulfillment experience. Instead of like, are my parents going to hate me because I sleep with guys? It's like, oh man, I'm going to tell Vicky Vale that I'm a rich fucking billionaire with amazing gadgets that knows karate. So I think all of those things, there's a lot that speak to the queer experience, and that's why we get in there. And yes, like the X-Men are there, but I think the sort of like masked hero in general does speak to us as well. And I mean, let's be real, the X-Men are every minority, you know. They were the African American community and different communities of color, and then they became more obviously the gay community in the 90s when they had mutant AIDS, basically, in the case of the legacy virus. And you know, so they are a great, again, they're a great, excuse me, way to speak to different communities and also kind of bring them together because really they could be anyone. And it, again, it takes something that is a stressor in your life and gives you this fantasy where it wasn't something, you know, that was a stressor. It was something that was awesome. And I think that, you know, we all sort of like having those moments and thinking that maybe, you know, it tells us that these things about us are awesome.
Yeah.
From many points of view.
Excellent. Well, that's all the questions that I have. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this and taking your time out to do this with me.
Sure. I'm sorry. You sound really tired. I'm sorry I had to get up early.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah. No.
If I was before the morning, I would have had like straight narcolepsy though, and it would have been like a really long interview.
No, this is all good. It's great. Thank you very much. Yeah. I think we definitely do plan to have Midnighter in the future as a book, so maybe we can do this again sometime if you're up for it.
Sure. Let me know. I'd be happy to. And if there's anything else I can help with, my friend, let me know.
Excellent. Will do. Thanks a lot.
You got it, sir. I will talk to you soon. Thank you.
Cheers.